Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I'm professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar, and I also direct the Iranian Studies Unit here at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Today, we'll be looking at representations of Iranians in Western media. And to do so, we're joined by three distinguished experts who specialize on the topic. Let me briefly introduce them. I have an entire page on each of our distinguished guests here, and I'll be very brief in introducing them because if I were to do justice to their full biography, would be here all day. We have Professor Yahya Kamalipour, who's a professor of communication and former chair of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication at North Carolina A&T State University in the United States. Professor Kamalipour previously served as professor and head of communication and creative arts at Purdue University Northwest. He has published 18 books, and some of the most recent ones are Global Media, Perceptions of the United States, The Trump Effect, Global Communication, and another book called Global Communication, A Multicultural Perspective. This book is now in its third edition, Global Discourse in Fractured Times, and Media, Power, and Politics in the Digital Age. He's the founding director of Global Media Journals Network and founding president of Global Communication Association. We also have joining us Negar Mortazavi, an Iranian American journalist and political analyst, a brilliant political analyst, I should add, and host of the indispensable Iran podcast. Negar is based in Washington, D.C., and she's been covering Iranian affairs and U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East for over a decade. Negar has a master's degree from Brandeis University and a bachelor's degree from University of Massachusetts. You might have read Negar's many pieces or have heard her on CNN, NBC, NPR, BBC, France 24, Al Jazeera, and many other media outlets. Last but by no means least, we're joined by Dr. Assal, who's the research director at the National Iranian American Council, where she works on research and writing related to Iran policy issues and US-Iran relations. Dr. Rod's writings can be seen in Newsweek, The National Interest, The Independent, Foreign Policy, and many other media outlets. She's appeared as commentator for BBC World, Al Jazeera, NPR, and many other outlets. Dr. Rod has a PhD in Middle East history from the University of California, Irvine, and a forthcoming book from Cambridge University Press called The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. My sincere thanks to all three of you for joining us for this discussion. And let me just start. I have had the good fortune of living in a number of different countries and being based here in Doha. I'm a loyal watcher of Al Jazeera, and I see a distinct difference in the coverage, for example, between Al Jazeera, certainly Al Jazeera Arabic, but also English, and American media outlets such as CNN or NBC, or for that matter, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation. So if I could ask, Yahya, I'll start with you. Has there been over time a change in the way that Iran and Iranians are covered in the Western media? Sorry, Yahya, you're muted.
Okay. The answer is yes. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me briefly state that before the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the image of Iran or Persia in the United States was not negative as it is now. I came to the US in 1972, that's 7 years before the revolution. And I recall that, people did not have really a negative perception and often thought of Iran as an exotic place, were familiar with Persian rugs and Persian cats and all that. And then the 1979 revolution changed everything. And especially the hostage crisis negatively impacted the overall image of Iran, and impacted all of us individually as well. I can, talk about various experiences that I had myself, because coincidentally in 1979, I started teaching, and the hostage crisis took place. So that's, I don't want to go into details, but the hostage crisis certainly contributed to what we can call the war of images. And then what happened was that for 444 days, Iran was on the top of the news nationally and internationally. And of course, Hollywood started producing movies about Iran. There were at least 20 different movies about Iran produced, including Peacemaker in 1997, The Hitman in 1991, and Not Without My Daughter in 1998, Naked Gun, and Under Siege, and Delta Force. There are so many movies that really portrayed Iran negatively. And on the other hand, recently in 2002, George Bush referred to Iran, or put Iran in the axis of evil states. And in 2016, Donald Trump called Iran the world's #1 terrorist state. The revolution and the hostage crisis continue to have a overall negative impact on the image of Iran, unfortunately.
Thank you. Assal, you have one leg in academia and another in policy realm. And Yahya just referred to image of Iran in popular culture with these movies. How does this image in popular culture either relate to or reinforce public policy in relation to Iran?
Well, I actually authored a report earlier this year that made this exact argument, right? The argument was that the way that Iran has been portrayed, and Dr. Kamalipour, spoke to the very important sort of historical watershed moment that happens, which is in part the revolution, but it's actually the embassy seizure in November of 1979. And I always point this out because, people assume diplomatic relations get severed because of the revolution. But the revolution happens in February of 1979, and diplomatic relations aren't severed until November, when this embassy is seized by Iranian students. And of course, there's the historical context as to the view of Iranians themselves, especially the Iranian students who seized the embassy at the time. But when you look at after that period, the media portrayals, whether it's the political discourse of politicians, whether it's popular culture, or whether it's the news media, right? These different sort of prongs of communication with the American public and how the image of Iran is constructed within the American public directly impacts the policies that we see as well. And the reason I say that is because there are times in which the US officials in the United States government enacts policies that go against the will of the American people, that undermine US national security interests, that undermine global security interests. And we have to be able to explain why, for instance, that happens, why, you know, an administration like the Trump administration comes in 2017 and then in 2018 decides to tear up basically a nuclear agreement that was the crowning achievement of his predecessor, that was almost universally accepted as an unprecedented non-proliferation agreement that benefits everyone. Why does that happen? It doesn't benefit the United States to withdraw from it. It doesn't benefit global security to withdraw from it. So it happens because there are these ideological influences where Iran is seen as this sort of caricature of an enemy. And no matter what Iran does, it's always, and it does good things and it does bad things, like many states, and it does many bad things, just to be very clear. But in terms of a policy that's specified on something like nuclear proliferation and non-proliferation in this case, those have major global interests, of global security interests. So why do we undermine those things? Well, because there is an ideological bent where it's very easy in this climate to have like an anti-Iran sort of attitude. And I'll just give you one example. Just a couple of months ago, you had the Senate Republicans, a handful of Senate Republicans, have a press briefing where they're basically talking against the JCPOA, why they're against the nuclear deal, why they're against negotiations. And Senator Risch, in his comments, said something, I'm paraphrasing, but said something to the effect of, you know, he doesn't know the Persian language, but if he did, he would likely not find the words good faith anywhere in the language. And that kind of sort of blanket statement that makes it sound like, and these types of statements have been repeated over and over again by US officials, the idea that deception is in the DNA of Iranians, right? The fact that a senator in the US would make such a blatantly bigoted remark, that not only affects Iranians, by the way, but all Persian-speaking people, which are not only in Iran. That tells you, and the fact that there's barely any backlash outside of our own community, that tells you the sort of atmosphere we're in, where it's okay to make these sort of bigoted remarks and to use them, right? And to use these blanket statements as reasoning behind why a policy should not be enacted. So you see that direct interaction of the way this image is constructed, how that image is then used by politicians themselves, and how it is used to justify certain policy positions. So I would say that these two things are very much impactful on each other. And it's sort of a positive feedback loop, or a negative feedback loop, I should say, where, you know, you have this image, you have these policies, and then you continue to have that cycle occur.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I'm reminded of, I believe it was Wendy Sherman, who said it is in the Iranian DNA to lie, or in the DNA of Iranian policymakers to lie. And I was just flabbergasted when I heard that. And then it was the Trump administration that pulled out of the JCPOA. And
yeah. And actually, that's the interesting thing. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's bipartisan, right? This isn't like one party because there's often the distinction between Republicans and Democrats in the United States often is about their sort of identity politics. The way that Republicans talk about different groups and the way that Democrats do is quite distinct. Yet when it comes to Iranians specifically, they overlap. So you have members of different administrations, whether Republican or Democrat. I believe Hillary Clinton also made similar comments, you know, even though she was a proponent. That was the interesting thing. Even proponents of the deal, even people who supported the deal, still had to sort of take these jabs at the Iranian people, really. You know, the idea is to separate between the government and the people, but comments that talk about Iranians at large or their language or their culture clearly are not directed towards a government. They're directed towards anybody part of that group, and that's how many in the community, in the diaspora, feel as well when they hear those types of comments.
Yeah, thank you. Negar, Assal just referred to the Iranians doing a lot of bad things. I often think that the Iranian government is its own worst enemy. How does what this being tone deaf and how does this impact the statements and the actions coming out of Tehran? How do they play into this image of Iran and which is portrayed?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mehran, for the kind introduction and for having me to the Arab Center. Also, thank you for organizing. Yes, I very much agree. Want to echo what Assal and Yahya were saying, and also your comments, Mehran. Let me also add, Assal talked about it being bipartisan. Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator, has had a few instances of essentially dehumanizing all Iranians. He said if they found out that there was Persian or Iranian in his DNA, that would be awful. There was also another Republican senator recently, in the context of the nuclear deal, that suddenly came out and made a very dehumanizing comment about Iranians, essentially the Persian language, and which was also false. It was false, but he got away with it, and there wasn't much coverage. So I want to take a step back, Mehran, with your question in mind, and talk about how the media coverage is, in my view, to some extent biased and skewed, and why that happens. And part of that goes to your comment and your question that it's exactly the Iranian government, statements coming from Iranian officials, sometimes senior, sometimes an obscure minor official in some remote town will say something stupid, which stupid things are said by all kinds of officials around the world, but then they become headlines and they get picked up and become this constant coverage over and over again. The way that, for example, the comments by the American side about Iranians doesn't get that kind of cycle of coverage. It's also when it comes to the media, which is the world that I very much closely observe and watch as a journalist, and also as a guest analyst, I speak to a lot of journalists about Iran. I appear on multiple different international and Western channels to talk about Iran, and I'm in daily touch with the coverage of the country. It's also a lack of access when it comes to the media and the journalism, and that also goes back to the Iranian government's policies as far as them being their own worst enemies, as you're saying. Many Western outlets, American specific, but also other, at least Western European outlets or international outlets, don't have good access to Iran. They don't necessarily have bureaus in the country. They don't have reporters on the ground. Sometimes American reporters are granted permission to travel to the country temporarily. Usually I speak to a lot of American journalists. I give, they talk to me for advice, what to do, who to meet, and they go to the country for a week or two at most. I've never seen anybody spend on a visa more than a month in the country. So it's this lack of access and the sort of black box situation that the Iranian state has created, which makes it very hard to penetrate from the outside. It's also, I think, a lack of resources or enough incentives by Western outlets to invest in their coverage of Iran when it has to be done from a distance or with limited access. Many journalists who either cover the beat or occasionally do cover Iran don't speak English. They're not of Iranian background. They've never been to the country, or sometimes they fly in. There are a few number of journalists with Iranian background or who speak Persian, and they're doing excellent work in major outlets, but not every outlet has that kind of access to people who understand the country, understand the culture, understand the language, or have some sort of an educational background. You need something to understand the country to be able to cover it. And I think it's for a country in the region that has so much focus and so much attention, the amount of resources that media outlets have as far as, their staff and reporters understanding the country when they're covering it, is a lot less than the other countries in the region. It's also, there's another issue I think I want to highlight, is that the nuclear program, which is again part of the politics between Iran and the West, and specifically or mainly the US, has dominated a lot of the media coverage of Iran. It's essentially, you think the country is just a nuclear program, because the nuclear program is talked about so much over and over. And for a country that has a civilian program, and this is not my saying, this is the head of the CIA just recently reaffirming that Iran's program is still civilian, so much talk of a civilian program potentially one day becoming close to the margins of having fuel that could potentially be used for a bomb. It's just the politics of the countries that are essentially Iran's foes or rivals has impacted this media coverage very much. And when you hear as an audience, a global audience or a Western audience, when you just keep hearing about a country's nuclear program or a country's politics, that in itself has a dehumanizing effect. I'm not saying every journalist or every editor is dehumanizing Iranians purposely, but when it's limited to that, to one or two topics, security very much, and politics and foreign policy, then you don't have a very clear image of a country where 80 million people are also living. It's very diverse, of different ethnicities, backgrounds, religious. Many of them are opposed to the government's policies. Even within the government, there's different echelons of power. There's competition. So I think what's happening is that, yes, and sometimes I talk to my non-Iranian colleagues and they get a little bit offended because there's this image, at least in the US media, that American outlets are free and they're independent and they're not dictated, for example, as in an authoritarian setting. Their coverage is not dictated by the country's politics. And it's not like the government tells them how to cover it. But I think when it comes at least to foreign policy, and especially to the policy and the coverage of countries that are considered US foes, the coverage is very much impacted by the politics. And an instance or an interesting contrast to this is, for example, when you look at European outlets covering US-Iran tensions, I think they do a better job, more fair, more objective, because it's not their own countries they're talking about. Whenever they're talking about US and Iran, or Iran and its regional foes, I think certain European outlets or journalists do a more balanced job of the coverage. And also the difference is that Europeans, because European countries have diplomatic relations with Iran, they have diplomatic presence on the ground, their journalists travel to the country much easier, they get visas, some are present on the ground, still difficult, not completely free access, but they just tend to have a better understanding and better access of the country, which impacts their coverage. I'll stop there, but happy to get into this topic more.
Assal?
Well, I just wanted to, because in terms of the coverage specifically on the nuclear program that Negar was referring to understand the real life impact of that, I wanted to give an example. So Brookings Institute last year did a survey of public opinion, American public opinion. And in the survey, they found that more Americans falsely believe that Iran possesses nuclear weapons than believe that Israel, which has an arsenal of nuclear weapons, possesses nuclear weapons. So the fact that that is what the American public thinks, I mean, there's sort of this cliche about Americans being ignorant towards politics or even geography or what's going world affairs. And that's not an insult to the American public. That's an insult to the institutions that are meant to inform them, right? People are not just inherently given given information within their DNA. They have to receive that information through institutions. Two of the pillars of those institutions are education and news media, right? That's where they get their information from. So that coverage is not without consequence. The consequence of that coverage is this is why the American perception is what it is, a totally skewed view of reality. And in a democratic country, which is what the US is meant to be, in a democracy, in order for citizens of that country to be able to make informed decisions to affect policy, which is what it's supposed to be, right? We're supposed to have representatives that carry out the will of the American people. They have to be informed themselves. The way that they believe policies are being enacted is skewed by the fact that they don't have the right information to begin with. So it's not just that, oh, we're talking about, well, this stuff is being covered this way. We are seeing the impact of what happens when they are covered in this manner.
Yeah, thank you. I want to come back.
Can I make a quick note, Maher?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
One
Yes.
final follow-up. I promise I'll stop talking about the nuclear program. But again, going back to my previous points and piggybacking on what Assal said, when there are comments, for example, by US officials, and I cover this nuclear issue, US-Iran, very closely. I have covered it in Vienna and in the past almost a decade. When there are comments by US officials as far as Iran getting to a dangerous point when it comes to its nuclear program, I don't know, on the threshold of the fissile material, that gets blanket coverage, at least here in the US. But for example, when the CIA had, not just recently, not long ago, Bill Burns, said at, I believe, a think tank here in DC, he said at a public setting that the CIA concludes, US intelligence concludes that Iran's nuclear program is still civilian. There was very, very little coverage of that, of basically US intelligence, a US official, top official assuring that Iran's nuclear program in a way is not dangerous from their view. So it's also one other point as far as how politics impacts the coverage.
Yeah, thank you. I want to come back to this, but Yahya, you mentioned war of images, and we've been hearing a lot on how the US media covers Iran. There are a number of media outlets that are based in Iran. There's Al Hor, there's Press TV. Is Iran at all successful in its public diplomacy? Is it able to portray a different message, either through these or through social media, Twitter, Clubhouse, other means?
Well, the communication channels are available in addition to Press TV and other channels inside Iran. They have social media, but the issue is messaging. And that, one of my favorite comments when it comes to image and perception is a statement by Walter Lippmann, who said that we act and react toward each other based on images in our heads. That's an important statement. And where do those images come from? Of course, what happens in Iran, what the officials do there, what the media, the national media or international media based in Iran report is important. And let me also mention that in California and elsewhere, there are some 30 plus television channels, there are radio programs, there are podcasts, but unfortunately they are, sort of disjointed, disconnected. They do not send similar or the same messages. I think they have a more negative impact on the overall image of Iran, and that's unfortunate because these media could have a positive impact. And of course, reporters and researchers like Negar and Assal are extremely powerful in what they do. And but the thing is that we have to join hands, and a program like this should be done more often and look at this important issue from a different perspective. So again, I agree with Assal and Negar that we are all impacted somehow, regardless of where we are, when it comes to the image of Iran or Iranians portrayed in the U.S. media. And as you know, Mehran, the U.S. media are owned by corporations, big conglomerates. And of course, they are all, follow their leads from their sort of parent companies, and tend to, portray a similar messages and images.
Thank you. You mentioned that Iranian media, particularly the media that is based in Los Angeles or in Southern California, is disjointed. Does this media itself play into a certain stereotype or a certain image? Or are any of you panelists? I would appreciate any comment on that.
Well, if I may, before I forget, one of the positive documentaries or programs that I have seen was done by Anthony Bourdain. He went to Iran, and I'm sure you have seen it. I mean, that was I think an excellent representation and somewhat unbiased representation of Iran. So the Iranian media in the US, in Los Angeles, help or hurt the overall image? I think among ourselves, we can see that they amplify the division between the Iranians in the US. And of course, the message that they send to Iran is also, I think, not as productive as it should be. It's just divisive. And again, I studied and watched the various programs a number of years ago and wrote a report about that. But that trend continues, unfortunately.
Thank you. Negar?
I just want to add a comment that I'm not speaking about any specific media outlet, and it really depends on which show, which journalist, which kind of coverage. I don't want to generalize, but I agree with Yahya. This phenomenon happens both by diaspora media and also, certain Iranians in the diaspora who may or may not necessarily be working in media and cultural products. Is that I think the trend is that when they criticize the government, and you should criticize your government's bad behavior or bad policies. American outlets criticize their own government's bad policies, and that's essentially what the media is for. But I think it conflates the government with the people or with the whole country, or it's referred to as Iran, which when you talk about Iran, it doesn't necessarily mean only the state, it means the country and the population, or Iranians instead of Iranian government or Iranian government officials. And it plays into this big cycle of dehumanizing 80 million of people or a large population, with the aim of criticizing the policies of the government, but essentially generalizing that to the entire population. And the problem is that the counter narrative is either very weak or it's non-existent, because when it comes to the US, for example, we're talking about just one example. This is a country that has a very, very strong and present counter narrative across the world. There's Hollywood, there's all kinds of American cultural products, media organizations. So when American policies, and there are a lot of bad American policies, when bad policies are challenged, there's also a counter narrative or a complementary narrative, and a lot of products that the people around the globe can consume to get a fuller picture of what this country is or what the American people are. But in the case of Iran, and I'm sure other similar countries some are like that, that complementary narrative doesn't exist, or it's very, very minimal.
Thank you. There's a number of questions that have come to me from our audiences. But before I get to those questions, I wanted to zero in particularly on the coverage of Iranian women in Iran, and the way they're covered in the Western media. Is there, if you go to Iran, if you know any Iranian women, two of the most successful examples of whom are right here, you know that there's a dissonance, huge dissonance between the way that they're generally portrayed in the Western media or in news outlets as compared to the reality on the ground. Would any of you care to comment on that?
I'd be happy to start.
Please.
I think one of the sort of narratives that exists within Western media, and this is not exclusive to Iranians. This is basically about like Muslim women. So like Muslim women, women in the Middle East, these sort of like broader concepts that these women need to be saved. And there's a sort of like savior complex from the Western states, a lot of it which is, deeply embedded within colonial language, right? Colonialism was language that never went in to colonize a state and say, we're here to steal all of your goods and your labor. We're here to, if you're the British, if you're the US, if you're any of these European states who partook in this process, it was always to civilize, right? It was always to help. This is what everybody was there for, according to those colonial sources themselves. So that type of language, that you have this outside power who sees itself as superior culturally, civilizationally, in any way that you can think, to the group that it's trying to civilize. You see that the roots of that within this current sort of discourse that makes it seem like these women need to be saved. Now, much like, unfortunately, throughout the entire world, there is, we live in a system of patriarchy. Women are at a disadvantage because of that system, and there have been feminist movements and women's rights movements throughout the world in order to sort of rectify those differences. In the case of Iran, I think what you're talking about is this idea that it paints them almost as weak characters, and nothing could be further from the truth. The fact that, like in Iran, and this is in post-revolutionary contemporary Iran, there are more female students at university than there are male students, something that if you were to say to a sort of the broad Western public, they would probably not be aware of, right? Based on these assumptions that women have no access to these things. Now, they lack equal rights, certainly, but they are extremely successful in multiple industries. I just think about, the film industry in Iran versus like the film industry in the US. There are behind and in front of the camera women everywhere in the film industry in Iran. And that's just one example. There are, of course, other industries in which there are more limits in how they can navigate those spaces. But this is a group of women who, not just recently, but through multiple generations over the last century and before, have always been part of Iran's political story, right? If there were revolutionaries in the streets, women were amongst them. If there are protesters in the streets today, women are amongst them. So this is a population that is not passive, is not sort of sitting back and hoping that they're just saved, but are taking an active participatory role in the sort of political changes in their own country. And so I think sometimes that coverage is lacking. And then the one thing I'll add, and before giving the floor to our other speakers, of course, is there's also a tendency to sort of like appropriate feminist discourse by Western media and Western coverage, and ignore certain parts of that society. And I think that's extremely problematic, right? We raise the voices that echo the sort of political ideas that we have, but we silence the voices that don't do that. And the reason why that's problematic is it lacks nuanced understanding of the population that we're dealing with. And I'll give a very quick parallel example. If somebody was trying to look at the United States, analyze it and understand the political milieu of the United States, and you sort of just ignored the supporters of someone like Donald Trump, you ignored the more right-wing or Tea Party base that exists in the United States, you would not have a clear picture of what is happening across the board. You would have an understanding of parts of the country, but you wouldn't have a full picture of the reality on the ground. And so I think that's another thing that we see in the coverage, is that it's a very selective coverage, and it's based on whether or not it parrots the sort of political points of the person trying to make whatever point they're trying to make.
Thank you. Negar?
And I want to point to a very good example. This is from a few years ago, I believe, maybe 8 years ago. Reza Aslan, another California-based Iranian American academic, had an interview on CNN where he was essentially challenging the Islamophobic comments that were previously made by Bill Maher. Actually, Bill Maher also is one top figure who does vilify Islam and Muslims on his show a lot. And then Reza Aslan also gets into a similar argument with the host doing that live interview on CNN. This is on CNN. He was doing the interview with Don Lemon and Alyssa Kamrava, if I'm not wrong. And essentially, I want to read this quote. He's saying, we're not talking about women in the Muslim world. We're talking about 2 or 3 examples. This is what Reza Aslan says, to justify a generalization, and that is the definition of bigotry. And I want to connect this to our conversation of the coverage of Iran, is that a lot of times we also see that this vilifying or the dehumanization of Muslims, which is, as Assal very well said, an extension of this post-colonial discourse, plays out in different ways when it comes to the U.S., in the case of the U.S. foes or U.S. allies. So yes, there are Muslim countries where you are, for example, Mehran, in your area, there are Muslim countries that are not all U.S. rivals. There are U.S. partners or U.S. allies. And the discourse when it comes to those countries is very different than when it comes to populations that are U.S. Rivals. And then another example is Donald Trump's travel ban. So when candidate Trump was on the campaign trail, at some point, essentially, he came out and he said he's going to have a complete and total shutdown of all Muslims coming to the United States until we find out, quote, what the hell is going on. And then when he came into the White House, he realized that something as bigoted as that is impossible in today's world in the U.S. to implement. And then it trickles down to a few Muslim countries, mainly U.S. rivals, and Iran being the top country, or essentially the main population being impacted by the travel ban. So it was a Muslim ban, but then it came down to countries, Iran, Syria, and a few others. That goes back to our discussion of how politics influences the image, and also essentially the perception and the image leads to, again, policy. So it's a cycle that perpetuates itself.
Thank you. One of my colleagues here, Dr. Aisha Al-Basri at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, she asks a question from the other way. And I wonder, Yahya, if you could talk about it, or any of the other panelists. Can you comment on Iranian media's coverage of America and Americans? Does it offer a mirrored image of skewed or biased coverage, or is it fair and balanced? Or as fair and balanced as possible?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I do not watch Iranian media, but based on what I have seen during my earlier trips to Iran, no, the coverage is not balanced. In fact, it's very similar. So they focus on the negatives, and here in the US, they focus on the negative as well. So it is a two-way street, and far from being balanced. And that's my understanding based on what I know.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Negar.
I agree with Yahya. I also try to follow Iranian media. It's not a monolith. There's state media, the IRIB, the television and radio, which is completely owned by the state. But there's also newspapers that are more independent, privately owned, and more diverse. Some are even critical of the government and challenge the state's policies. But overall, no, it's, as Yahya said, it's not fair, it's not balanced, and it's sort of a mirror image of the US side's coverage of Iran. Iranian journalists also don't have access to the US. They don't get visas very easily to travel here. Iranian outlets don't have bureaus here in the United States, very few, I think 1 or 2 in New York, only within the realms of the UN, and their visas are very limited. They can't travel out of New York, out of a 20-mile radius, and it's only because they're covering the United Nations. So as far as covering the US, they have to do it mostly from a distance. Yes, most of them speak English more than American journalists speak Farsi. Iranian journalists do understand and speak English, and they do consume American cultural products. Again, as I said before, there's so much material out there that you can learn about this country. So in a way, it's the understanding is deeper, but also the politics of the country very much influences and impacts the coverage. So each side essentially is airing their own grievances against the other and repeating it over and over in the media without having a balanced view of what the other is viewing of them.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about the dehumanization of Iranians and the distorted image of Iran. There's a question that has come asking the impact and the influence of the Israeli lobby in this distortion of the image and the dehumanization of Iranians. Would any of you care to comment or answer that question? Does the Israeli lobby play a role in this?
I can comment. I wanted to talk about the impact of interest groups, and it's not just the pro-Israel lobby, it's also, you know, Iran's other rivals in the region, some Arab states, powerful Arab states that have, you know, spent a lot of money in this town where I am in Washington, D.C. on lobbying, on image building. It's also another layer to this, which is when countries have a diplomatic presence, for example, here in the US, not that they can control the media narrative, but if there are cases of dehumanizing or false information being put out about a country or its population, you see that the diplomatic centers, be it the embassies or you know, the cultural side of the diplomatic presence, will try to, you know, get in touch either behind the scenes or publicly and try to correct course. In the case of Iran, there's no diplomatic presence, there's no cultural funding being spent in the US, and, you know, more limited in other countries. So that connection with the media and the coverage is limited. But then on the other hand, the opposite side is pouring a lot of money into not only building the image, the desired image for their own countries, but also in controlling the narrative of their rivals. So we know, for example, the Saudi government spends a lot of money in Washington, the Emiratis spend a lot of money in Washington, and these are powerful rivals of Iran, and they have been reported instances of how they control the narrative or influence the narrative when it comes to think tanks, to analysis, to reports, to research, and then also to media coverage, experts who appear in various media outlets. So yes, it definitely has a very strong impact.
Thank you. Assal?
If I can add, I just wanted to say, you know, and I brought up the earlier example about the public perception of the possession of nuclear weapons. So the flip side of the sort of anti-Iran narrative which has an ideological bent, is a pro-Israel narrative that also has an ideological bent. And the reason I say that is because, again, where there are policies that we enact that, say, undermine national and global security interests because there's this ideological almost fanatic view that is anti-Iran, we have the opposite with Israel. And so the example of that is essentially no matter what Israel does, whether it violates, the very sort of discourse and rhetoric that the U.S. uses to sanction not only Iran but many countries, such as human rights abuses, undemocratic processes, things like that within those countries, or invasions of other countries, occupying other states. All of these types of bad behavior that the U.S. often cites that go against human rights and international law and the international rules-based order. Israel commits these things all the time, right? It's the leading human rights organizations of the world have concluded that Israel's actions constitute apartheid, crimes against humanity. When there's any attempt by international bodies to investigate even war crimes committed by Israel, they're rebuffed by the state itself, and the U.S. essentially supports this. So the fact that the U.S. has earmarked $3.8 billion of aid, of military aid to Israel every year, and that it is by its own definition unconditional, right? What does that mean to say that something is unconditional? It is quite literally what it's saying. It doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter if they violate human rights. It doesn't matter if they violate international law. That aid will still be given because there's no condition for it. And so within this sort of political discourse that you see in the US, while we often paint our adversaries as these sort of fanatic states, they're ideological, they're this and that, we ignore that sort of ideological bent within the country itself and the policies that we enact, both domestically and foreign, by the way. There's tons of examples of domestic US policy that is also driven by religious fervor, by any other types of sort of ideological reasoning rather than the merits of the policies themselves.
Thank you. Yahya, what does this portrayal of Iranians tell us about production of knowledge and education? As an educator, as a professor for many decades now in the United States, how does the way that Iran is portrayed influence the way you're able to connect to and get through to your students and explain and educate your students?
Now, when it comes to education, of course, all of us play an important role as teachers, as reporters, as writers, and students have very little knowledge about Iran. It doesn't matter where, at what university, and there are no courses taught about Iran. Of course, there are a few centers on Persian studies or Iranian studies in various universities, but generally speaking, at most universities, there are no courses, no centers focusing on Iranian studies. And that's, I think that should be something that we should pay attention to. And of course, each of us can contribute to correcting the misperceptions as in our classes. But that's all we can do, or writing. But again, that's very limited when it comes to the global scope.
Well, we're hoping to do that here in the Iranian Studies Unit in our own small way. Negar?
I just want to add a positive note that I think the situation has gotten much better. I mean, I'm sure you and Yahya have been doing this and observing it for much longer, but I moved to the US in 2002, right in between the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. And I remember not only Iran, but again, the axis of evil and sort of the dehumanization of Middle Easterners, Arabs, and then by extension, Iranians, Muslims and Iranians. I think we have come a long way. There are a lot more academics of Iranian background, journalists of Iranian background. There are institutions like where Assal works, and more organizations like the one you are heading, Mehran. And I think more knowledge is being produced. People are pushing back more now when there's a racist comment about Iranians or the dehumanizing comment. You hear a loud voice from the community. You hear powerful voices in the community joining in and pushing back. So I think we've come a long way, and it's moving in a good direction, but we also have a long way to reach the ideal that all of us, I think, are assuming.
Negar, I couldn't think of a better way to bring our discussion to a close. In fact, I wanted to end on a note of looking into the future, and I'm really grateful that you brought that up. Our time is almost up, but Assal and Yahya, is there anything you wanted to add in terms of steps that we or either we could take, or steps that could be taken to help remedy some of this coverage?
Educating and informing, and that is what your center is doing, and that is what we are doing as individuals, in the US and elsewhere. That's the key. And then, of course, at the more global level, I think that's a tall order. But if the 30 plus television, Persian, Iranian, abroad television stations, radio stations could somehow coordinate and portray Iran in a more positive light, at least to ourselves, right? And reduce the tension and the division. I think that's an important step. And I think I agree with Assal that the situation is getting better. And that, of course, something that we have. The momentum is there. We have to take advantage of the momentum and move on and do whatever we can in our capacities to inform and educate.
Thank you very much. Assal?
I mean, I would agree with Negar and Yahya, and basically say, and this is my way of thanking you for having this platform and for giving us the opportunity to have these conversations. I think these discussions are very important. And I think it's beyond just, us having this conversation. It's having these conversations in different places. Sometimes these conversations are uncomfortable because there's a lot of pushback to things that you say, because we've become so accustomed to certain narratives that when you try to push back against them, when you try to say, well, let's just take a step back and think about this rationally, rather than with all of this baggage that we're bringing into it, it can cause tension for people. It could cause some sort of discomfort. And that's not just in this conversation, that's in many conversations that make people uncomfortable, because it's asking you to question sort of the status quo. It's asking you to question the way that things are and what we've become accustomed to. But in order to grow as a community, as a society at large, those are the very conversations that we have to have that push us to think more deeply about the status quo.
Thank you. We could spend another couple of hours discussing this, but unfortunately our time has come to an end. And I want to apologize to those audience members whose questions we couldn't get to. There's a number of the questions that we just didn't have time to. But let me take this opportunity to thank our panelists. It's been an absolutely wonderful and insightful conversations. My sincere thanks to Yahya Kamalipour, Assal Rad, and Negar Mortazavi. And also my thanks to all of our audience members and our people who've tuned in or are watching us on social media in Iran, in the United States, here in Qatar, and around the world. My sincere thanks, and we'll see you soon again. Thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for your invitation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.